My sister-in-law faked terminal cancer for our entire wedding, then I exposed her at the reception. My wife's sister Rachel announced her stage 4 diagnosis during our engagement party. Every wedding planning session became about her final wishes. Every family gathering revolved around her brave battle. I knew she was lying. I work in oncology billing. The hospital she claimed used? No oncology department. But who accuses someone of faking cancer? So I watched her drain our wedding fund for treatment. Watched my wife cry herself to sleep. Rachel was good. Shaved her head. Lost weight deliberately. Created fake hospital bracelets. Oscar-worthy performance. The wedding became Rachel's farewell tour. Demanded maid of honor. Chose the venue for her final journey. Made photographer promise focus, in case these are my last photos. 3 weeks before, she started a GoFundMe. Raised $85,000 for experimental treatment in Switzerland. People donated college funds. Grandmother sold jewelry. Co-workers took second jobs. I started recording everything. Rachel crying about nausea publicly, then filmed scarfing sushi. 2 week for wedding prep, caught at gym doing CrossFit. Posted about chemo brain while running investment schemes with donations. She convinced my wife to uninvite friends. Crowds overwhelmed my immune system. Then threw massive party with those same people, calling my wife Bridezilla. Wedding day. Rachel in unnecessary wheelchair, wearing dress that cost more than our ceremony, bought with cancer funds. During vows, staged medical emergency. While everyone panicked, whispered to boyfriend thinking mic off, did photographer get my collapse? Need it for documentary? Mic was on. Church heard everything. She recovered, claimed morphine confusion. People believed her. Always did. Reception speech about love conquering death. Guests sobbing. Our wedding became her theatrical debut. Announced flying to Switzerland tomorrow. I stood up. Before you go, Rachel, I have something. Handed envelope. Surprise from everyone. She opened it on stage, expecting money. Found screenshots. Gym membership showing daily attendance during chemo. Restaurant receipts when hospitalized. Miami vacation during fictional surgery. GoFundMe money and investment accounts. The killing blow. Video from her treatment hospital. Receptionist on camera. Never had that patient. We don't have oncology. We're a psychiatric facility. Silence. Rachel tried running. 2 officers at exit. Fraud over $50,000 is federal. She screamed she was really sick. Clutched chest dramatically. When nobody reacted, dropped the act. You're all so fucking gullible. I gave you purpose. Judge disagreed. 8 years. Full restitution. Wife devastated. Not just betrayal, but relief she felt. Months mourning someone not dying. Wedding video went viral. 300 guests realizing they'd been conned by woman in unnecessary wheelchair, wig over shaved head, faking cancer she never had. Netflix made documentary. Terminal lies. Rachel gets nothing. Money goes to actual patients. She writes from prison, still claiming sickness. Prison doctors note, perfect health, refuses psychological evaluation. But last week everything changed. Got call from prison. This is Warden Davies, concerning Rachel Morrison. What about her? She's in the medical ward. Real diagnosis this time. Blood went cold. She's faking again. No. Confirmed by 3 oncologists. Stage 3 ovarian cancer. I laughed. Actually laughed. That's impossible. Discovered during mandatory health screening. Spread to lymph nodes. This is another con. Sir, I'm calling because she's refusing treatment. What? Says nobody will believe her. Says she'd rather die than have people think she's lying again. That's manipulation. Maybe. But she's also refusing visitors. Except you. Me? Has something to tell you. Says it's about your wedding video. Something that wasn't supposed to be filmed. I filmed everything. She says check minute 47:23. Behind the church. Someone in the parking lot. Found the footage. Background of reception video. Barely visible through window. Someone in parking lot. Medical scrubs. Injecting something into car. Our car. That's why she wants you here, Warden continued. Says she knows who that is. Says they've been trying to kill your wife since the wedding. My wife had been having mysterious symptoms for months. Fatigue, confusion. Doctors found nothing. She could be lying. Sir, she's given us names, dates, details about your wife's symptoms we haven't made public. This is just another game. Your wife's blood work from last month showed traces of ethylene glycol, antifreeze. Someone's been poisoning her slowly. Phone slipped from my hand. Rachel had been evil, but maybe not the only evil. She says she'll tell you everything, but only in person. Only before the surgery she's refusing. When's the surgery scheduled? Tomorrow, 9 a.m. If she refuses, she dies within weeks. My wife was at her checkup right now, with the same doctor she'd been seeing since the wedding. The one who kept saying nothing was wrong. The one who'd recommended she increase her vitamins. The ones that made her sicker. Sir, will you come? I grabbed my keys. I'm on my way. Text from wife. Doctor says I need new medication. Starting today. Should help with symptoms. Photo attached. The pills looked exactly like what I'd seen in the parking lot video. I floored the gas pedal through 3 red lights. My phone kept going straight to voicemail. The hospital was 20 minutes away, but I made it in 12. Other drivers honked and swerved around me. I didn't care. That photo of those pills kept flashing in my head. The same ones from the parking lot video. The same ones someone injected into our car on our wedding day. My wife was about to swallow poison and call it medicine. I screeched into the hospital parking garage and left my car blocking 2 spots. Ran through the automatic doors. The receptionist yelled something about signing in, but I was already past her desk. 3rd floor. I knew the building from my oncology billing work. Took the stairs 3 at a time because waiting for an elevator might cost seconds I didn't have. My lungs burned by the 2nd floor, but I kept climbing. Burst through the stairwell door into the hallway. Room 314. I could see it at the end of the corridor. The door was closed. I sprinted. The door flew open under my hand. My wife sat in the exam chair. Doctor. McBride stood next to her holding an orange prescription bottle. His hand was extended toward her. She was reaching for it. I lunged forward and knocked the bottle from his grip. Pills exploded across the tile floor. Orange capsules scattered everywhere. My wife screamed. McBride stumbled backward. They both stared at me like I'd grown a second head. My chest heaved. Sweat dripped down my face. My wife's mouth hung open. McBride recovered first and moved toward the pills on the floor. I stepped between him and the scattered medication. My wife grabbed my arm. Her fingers dug into my bicep. I yanked my phone out and pulled up the wedding video. Zoomed in on minute 47:23. That grainy figure in the parking lot. Medical scrubs. Syringe in hand. Our car. I shoved the screen toward both of them. McBride's face went white. Actually white. Like someone had drained all the blood out of him. He took a step back toward his desk. Something about the way he moved made my stomach twist. Too calculated. Too aware. My wife's fingers tightened on my arm. She asked what was happening. Her voice shook. I kept my eyes on McBride while I explained. The prison call. Rachel's information. The ethylene glycol in her blood work. Someone poisoning her for months. McBride backed up another step. His hand reached behind him, feeling for the desk. His eyes darted to the door. I saw it happen in his face. The decision. He bolted, just turned and ran for the hallway. I tackled him before he made it 3 steps. We hit the floor hard. He was bigger than me, but I had surprise and fear on my side. My wife screamed for security. McBride tried to throw me off. I got my arm around his neck, not to hurt him, just to hold him. He thrashed and kicked, knocked over a metal tray. Medical instruments clattered across the floor. My wife kept screaming. Footsteps pounded in the hallway. 2 security guards burst through the door. They pulled me off McBride. I didn't fight them, just pointed at the scattered pills on the floor, started shouting about poison, about the video, about my wife's symptoms. One guard held me while the other helped McBride up. I pulled my phone out again, showed them the parking lot footage, explained about the antifreeze in her blood. The guard holding McBride looked at him. Really looked at him. McBride was breathing hard. Wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. The guard asked if this was true. McBride said I was crazy, said I'd assaulted him. But his voice cracked. The guard told him to stay put, sent his partner to get the pills from the floor. My wife collapsed into the exam chair, just folded in on herself, stared at the prescription bottle the guard picked up. Her hands shook. She'd been about to take one, about to swallow whatever McBride had given her. The guard bagged the bottle, called for backup on his radio. Police arrived in 14 minutes. I counted every second. 2 officers, a detective. I explained everything again, showed the video, told them about Rachel's claims, about the ethylene glycol, about months of my wife getting sicker while McBride kept saying nothing was wrong. The detective looked at McBride, asked if he wanted to make a statement. McBride demanded his lawyer. The detective nodded. Put him in handcuffs anyway. Read him his rights while bagging the pills as evidence. Told my wife she needed immediate blood work. Different doctor. Different lab. She nodded but didn't speak. Just sat there staring at the floor where those pills had scattered. The detective asked if she'd taken any medication McBride prescribed recently. She said yes. Yesterday. The vitamins he'd recommended. The detective's jaw tightened. He called for an ambulance. My wife finally looked at me. Asked if Rachel really told me all this. I nodded. She asked why Rachel would help us. I said I didn't know. The ambulance took 20 minutes. They loaded my wife onto a gurney. Started an IV right there in the exam room. The paramedic asked what she'd been exposed to. I told him ethylene glycol. Possibly other compounds. He wrote everything down. Asked how long. I said months. He swore under his breath. Told his partner to call ahead to the ER. They needed a toxicology team ready. My wife reached for my hand as they wheeled her out. I squeezed her fingers. Promised I'd be right behind her. The detective stopped me in the hallway. Asked for my contact information. Wanted to know where I'd gotten the information about McBride. I told him about the prison call, about Rachel. He wrote down her name, asked if she'd given me anything else. I said she'd talk, but only to me. Only before her surgery tomorrow morning. The detective said he'd need to be there. I said fine. Just let me see my wife first. I called the prison from my car in the hospital parking lot. Told Davies I was coming. But first I needed to know everything Rachel said. Every detail. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he told me Rachel had identified McBride by name 3 days ago, described the parking lot incident, the medical scrubs, the syringe, the time. She knew details she couldn't have known unless she was there, unless she saw it happen. I asked why she didn't say anything sooner. Davies said she tried, wrote letters, called. Nobody believed her. Why would they? She was a convicted fraud artist, a cancer faker, someone who'd lied about everything. He said she finally convinced him to check the wedding video, to look at that specific timestamp. That's when he called me. I asked if he believed her about the cancer. Davies said 3 oncologists confirmed it. Stage 3. Lymph nodes. Surgery tomorrow or she'd die within weeks. I thanked him, hung up, sat in my car for 5 minutes trying to process. Rachel had been evil, but McBride might be worse. My wife got admitted to the hospital for emergency treatment. They put her in a room on the 5th floor, started pumping fluids and collating agents through her IV. A doctor I'd never seen before came in, explained they needed to flush the poison from her system, said it would take hours, maybe days depending on how much had built up. My wife lay in the bed looking small, fragile. She asked if I was really going to trust Rachel. After everything she did, after she destroyed our wedding, stole from everyone, made us all look like fools. I sat in the chair next to her bed, admitted I didn't know, but we were out of options. Rachel had been right about McBride, right about the poison, right about details nobody else knew. My wife closed her eyes, said she didn't know if she could forgive Rachel even if she was telling the truth. I said she didn't have to. She just had to let me find out what else Rachel knew. I drove to the prison that evening. The sun was setting. Orange light cut through my windshield. My mind spun in circles. Rachel had faked cancer, destroyed our wedding, stolen $85,000, gone to prison for fraud. And now she might have saved my wife's life. The two things didn't fit together, couldn't exist in the same person. But they did. A guard met me at the entrance, checked my ID 3 times, made me empty my pockets, walk through a metal detector. Another guard escorted me through the facility. We went through 4 locked doors. Each one clanged shut behind us. The medical ward was in a separate wing, cleaner than the rest. Quieter. The guard stopped at a door. Told me I had 30 minutes, knocked twice, opened it. Rachel sat in a hospital bed wearing a thin gown. She looked sick. Actually sick. Not the performance from our wedding. Her skin was gray. Her eyes had dark circles. She'd lost weight, but not the deliberate starvation from before. This was different. Real. She met my eyes when I walked in. Didn't smile. Didn't perform. Just looked at me. Said she knew I wouldn't believe her about the cancer. Nobody did. Nobody would. But she needed me to believe her about McBride. About what he'd done. About what he was still doing. I sat in the chair next to her bed. Told her I was listening. Rachel pulled a folder from under her blanket. Thin hands shaking. The folder looked worn. Bent at the corners. She opened it and inside were papers. Medical documents. Hospital bracelets. All fake. All created by someone with access to real medical supplies. She pointed to a signature at the bottom of one document. Dr. Kieran McBride. The name made my stomach turn. My wife's current doctor, the one prescribing those pills. Rachel's voice came out quiet, broken. She told me McBride was her boyfriend before everything started, the one she whispered to during her staged collapse at our wedding. The photographer comment. That was him standing in the back watching, making sure everything went according to plan. She explained how he helped design the whole operation. He created the fake medical records, made the hospital bracelets in his office, taught her which symptoms to fake, which medications to pretend to take. He had access to everything she needed to make the cancer story believable. And he knew exactly how to exploit the medical system because he worked inside it. I stared at the documents. Professional letterhead, official stamps. Everything looked real because McBride had made them real. Used actual hospital equipment, actual medical forms, just filled them with lies. Rachel kept talking, her words tumbling out faster now. She said when I exposed her at the wedding, McBride disappeared, vanished completely, stopped answering her calls, deleted all their messages. She went to prison alone while he walked away clean. Nobody knew about his involvement. She protected him because she thought he loved her. Thought maybe he'd wait for her. Visit her. Help her somehow. Her voice cracked when she said that last part. I realized she'd been sitting in prison for 2 years protecting someone who abandoned her the second things went wrong. The betrayal in her tone sounded genuine, real in a way her cancer performance never had. She pulled out more papers, letters, prison mail with official stamps. The return address showed a P.O. box, no name. But Rachel said they were from McBride. Started arriving 6 months ago. She unfolded one and held it up so I could read it. The letter talked about mutual friends, unfortunate accidents, how people who talk too much sometimes experienced health problems. Nothing direct, nothing that would hold up as evidence. But the threat was clear. Keep quiet, or something bad happens. Rachel flipped to another letter. This one mentioned my wife specifically. Talked about how some people had access to vulnerable patients, how easy it would be for someone to develop mysterious symptoms, how doctors could prescribe treatments that made things worse instead of better. The letter never said McBride would hurt anyone, but the meaning was obvious. She told me McBride visited the prison 6 months ago, used his medical credentials to get in as a healthcare consultant, met with her privately, told her if she ever mentioned his name to anyone, her family would suffer. He said my wife was easy to access through his practice, said he could make her sick and nobody would ever know, make it look natural, like a disease or condition that developed over time. I asked why he would target my wife. Why now after 2 years? Rachel explained that McBride was scared I'd keep investigating, that eventually I'd find proof of his involvement in the fraud. He knew I worked in medical billing, knew I had access to records and systems, knew I was the one who caught Rachel in the first place. So he decided to eliminate the threat, kill my wife slowly, make it look like natural illness, destroy me emotionally so I'd stop looking into anything related to the case. She showed me more letters, a whole stack of them, carefully worded threats disguised as concern. McBride writing about mutual acquaintances who'd gotten sick, about how fragile health could be, about unexpected complications that arose during routine treatment. Every letter was evidence but also completely deniable, nothing concrete enough to prosecute, just enough to terrify someone sitting alone in a prison cell. Rachel said she'd been collecting them for months, documenting everything, knowing nobody would believe her, but hoping someday someone would listen. She kept them hidden in her cell, made copies through the prison library, built a case against the man who'd destroyed her life and then threatened her family. I looked at the medical documents spread across her bed, the fake records McBride created, the letters he sent, the threats disguised as friendly advice. Everything pointed to him, everything connected back to my wife's doctor. Then I asked about her cancer, the real diagnosis, the surgery scheduled for tomorrow. Rachel laughed. The sound came out bitter and sharp. She said it was the biggest joke in the world, spent 2 years faking cancer, went to prison for it, became famous for lying about being sick, and now she actually had it. Stage 3 ovarian cancer. Spread to her lymph nodes. Real biopsies. Real pathology reports. Real oncologists confirming the diagnosis. She pulled out more papers. These ones different from the fakes. Official prison medical records. Biopsy results with her inmate number printed at the top. Surgery authorization form signed by the prison medical director. CT scans showing tumors. Everything documented by people who had zero reason to help her lie. Prison doctors who probably hated her for what she did. The surgery schedule showed tomorrow morning at 9. Major operation, 6 to 8 hours. Remove the primary tumor and affected lymph nodes. Then chemotherapy if she survived. Radiation if it spread further. Standard treatment protocol for stage 3 ovarian cancer. Rachel looked at me with tired eyes. Said she deserved prison. Deserved people doubting her. Deserved every bit of hate she'd gotten. But she couldn't stand the thought of spending her last months being accused of faking again. Couldn't handle people thinking this was another con, another performance, another scheme for attention or money or sympathy. She said she'd rather die with some dignity than go through treatment while everyone whispered that she was lying. Rather let the cancer kill her than face months of people analyzing her symptoms, questioning her pain, accusing her of staging everything again. I told her that was the dumbest thing I'd ever heard, that if her information about McBride was real, then she needed to stay alive to testify, needed to go through with the surgery and treatment, needed to help put him in prison for what he did to my wife and for his role in the original fraud. Rachel looked at me. Actually looked at me instead of performing. Her voice came out small, uncertain. She asked if I actually believed her about any of this, about McBride, about the threats, about her cancer being real. I admitted I didn't know what I believed anymore. But my wife almost died today. Rachel's information led directly to McBride's arrest. She knew details about the parking lot video that nobody else could have known. Knew about my wife's symptoms before they became public. Knew about the poisoning before anyone tested for it. That was enough for me to at least listen. Enough for her to accept treatment and stay alive to testify against him. Rachel stared at the surgery consent form on her bedside table. Unsigned. She'd been refusing to sign it for 3 days, letting the deadline approach, letting the cancer spread while she decided whether living was worth the doubt. She picked up the pen, held it over the signature line, asked me to promise something, promised that McBride would go to prison for what he did to my wife, for his role in the fraud, for threatening her family, for everything he'd gotten away with while she sat in a cell alone. I promised. Shook her hand across the hospital bed. The gesture felt strange, making deals with the woman who ruined our wedding, who stole from everyone we knew, who made my wife cry herself to sleep for months, but also the woman who might have saved my wife's life by telling the truth when nobody would believe her. Rachel signed the consent form, her signature shaky but clear. Surgery scheduled for tomorrow morning. If she survived, she'd testify. If the treatment worked, she'd help put McBride away. If people believed her this time, maybe she'd get something right for once in her life. I left the prison that night with Rachel's signed surgery consent form in my hand. Drove back to the hospital where my wife was still hooked up to IV fluids that were flushing the poison from her system. She was awake when I walked into her room, staring at the ceiling tiles with that blank look she'd had for months. The look I'd thought was just stress from Rachel's trial and the wedding disaster. Now I knew it was the antifreeze slowly shutting down her brain. I pulled a chair up to her bed and told her everything Rachel had said, about McBride being Rachel's boyfriend during the fake cancer scheme, about him helping create all the fake medical documents and hospital bracelets, about him threatening Rachel's family after I exposed the fraud, about him targeting my wife specifically because he was scared I'd keep investigating and eventually find his connection to the whole thing. My wife listened without interrupting, her eyes fixed on mine the whole time. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said she remembered something from her first appointment with McBride. He'd asked a lot of questions about our wedding, about Rachel's case, about how I'd figured out the fraud. She'd thought he was just making conversation, being friendly, getting to know his new patient. Now she realized he was gathering information, planning how to destroy us without getting caught himself. The police showed up at McBride's house around midnight. I know because Detective Harris called me at 12:47 a.m. to tell me what they'd found. McBride's home office had filing cabinets full of documents, medical records for my wife going back 6 months, every appointment, every symptom she'd reported, every test he'd ordered. But mixed in with the legitimate medical files were handwritten notes in the margins, notes about dosage increases, notes about symptom progression, notes about how long it would take before the poisoning became obvious enough that other doctors would catch it. They found a calendar on his desk with dates circled in red. The dates matched exactly with when my wife's symptoms had gotten worse. They found emails between McBride and someone using a fake name, but the writing style matched Rachel's letters from prison. The emails went back 2 years, to right before Rachel started her fake cancer scheme. McBride had helped her plan everything, had created the fake hospital records, had coached her on what symptoms to fake, had taken 40% of all the GoFundMe money as payment. They found bank statements showing deposits that matched the timeline of Rachel's fundraising. They found a burner phone with text messages to Rachel in prison, threatening her family if she ever told anyone about his involvement. McBride's lawyer showed up at the police station the next morning, trying to claim this was all a misunderstanding, that McBride had been treating my wife legitimately, that the notes in the margins were just his personal observations about her case, that the emails with Rachel were just him trying to help a patient's family member during a difficult time. But then the toxicology reports came back on those pills McBride had tried to give my wife. The lab tech called Detective Harris personally to tell him what they'd found. The pills weren't standard medication. They were custom-made at a compounding pharmacy McBride owned under a different name. The formula mixed regular vitamins with ethylene glycol in carefully measured doses. Just enough to make someone sick, not enough to kill them quickly. The perfect amount to cause slow organ damage that would look like a mysterious illness doctors couldn't diagnose. There was no medical reason to put antifreeze in any prescription medication. No legitimate treatment that required poisoning a patient. The pharmacy records showed McBride had been making these custom pills for 6 months, exactly as long as my wife had been his patient. My phone rang 3 days later while I was sitting in my wife's hospital room, watching her eat real food for the first time in weeks. The caller ID said Federal Prosecutor's Office. I answered and heard a woman's voice say her name was Mariana Fontana. She'd been the prosecutor who handled Rachel's fraud case. She'd watched Rachel get sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. Now she wanted to talk about reopening the investigation. She'd seen the evidence the police found at McBride's house, the emails, the bank records, the timeline that proved McBride had been Rachel's partner in the GoFundMe scheme from the beginning. She wanted to charge him as an accomplice in the original fraud case, on top of the attempted murder charges he was already facing. But she needed Rachel's cooperation, needed Rachel to testify about how McBride had planned everything, needed Rachel to explain how he'd manipulated her into being the public face while he stayed safely hidden in the background. Fontana said she could offer Rachel a deal, reduced sentence in exchange for full testimony against McBride, maybe cut her 8 years down to 4 with 2 already served. My wife grabbed my hand when she heard that, asked me what I thought about Rachel getting out of prison early. I drove to the prison the morning of Rachel's surgery, got there at 6 a.m. when the sky was still dark, and the parking lot was empty except for guard vehicles. Warden Davies met me at the entrance and walked me through security to the medical wing. Rachel was already in a hospital gown, sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall. She looked up when I walked in and tried to smile, but it came out wrong. She made some joke about karma being a real piece of work, about how she'd faked cancer for attention and money, and now she actually had it for real, about how the universe had a sick sense of humor. I told her my wife was going to be okay, that the doctors said she'd recover fully from the poisoning with no permanent damage. Rachel's face crumpled when I said that. She started crying, real tears, not the fake ones from her wedding performance. She said that was all she'd wanted, that she'd known McBride was dangerous, but she'd been too scared to say anything until she found out he was targeting my wife. That she'd rather die in prison than live knowing she could have stopped him and didn't. That at least now she'd done one thing right before the cancer killed her. The surgery took 6 hours. I sat in the prison medical facility waiting room the whole time because Warden Davies had told me Rachel listed me as her emergency contact. She had no one else. Her parents had disowned her after the fraud trial. Her friends had all abandoned her. The boyfriend who'd helped her fake the collapse at our wedding had disappeared the day she got arrested. I was the only person who'd visited her in 2 years. I called my wife around hour 4 and told her where I was. Expected her to be angry that I was sitting in a prison waiting for her sister to get out of surgery. But she just said it was okay. Said Rachel had earned at least this much decency by telling the truth about McBride. Said maybe this was the start of Rachel actually becoming a real person instead of a performance. The surgeon came out at 2 p.m. and introduced herself as Imogen McBride. I must have made a face because she quickly said no relation to Kieran, different family entirely. She'd actually testified against him at a medical board hearing years ago for ethical violations. She said the surgery had gone well. They'd removed the main tumor from Rachel's ovary and several lymph nodes that showed signs of cancer spread. But Rachel would need chemotherapy to kill any remaining cancer cells. The outlook was decent if Rachel completed the full treatment. Maybe 60 to 70% chance of surviving 5 years. Better odds than I'd expected. Better than Rachel deserved, but better than I wanted her to have too. Rachel woke up from the anesthesia around 5 p.m., asking if McBride was in jail. Her voice was rough from the breathing tube, and she could barely keep her eyes open, but that was her first question. I told her yes. McBride was being held without bail on attempted murder charges plus conspiracy in the original fraud case. Rachel smiled, this tiny, weak smile that actually looked genuine. She said that was better than any pain medication they could give her. Then she fell back asleep. The next 2 weeks moved fast. My wife got released from the hospital after 5 days of treatment. Her blood work came back clean. Her symptoms disappeared. She could think clearly again. Could remember things. Could function like a normal person instead of the confused, exhausted version of herself she'd been for months. Rachel started chemotherapy in the prison medical ward. I visited her twice during that time. Watched her throw up in a bucket. Watched her lose the hair she'd shaved off deliberately during her fake cancer scheme. This time it was real. This time there were no cameras, no performance. Just a sick woman in a prison hospital bed paying for her crimes while also fighting to stay alive. Prosecutor Fontana built her case against McBride using Rachel's testimony and all the evidence from his office. The emails, the bank records, the pharmacy receipts, the custom poison pills, the threatening letters. Everything Rachel had been too scared to reveal for 2 years. A woman named Lexi Travis called my phone 3 weeks after McBride's arrest. Said she'd been one of Rachel's friends during the fake cancer scheme, had donated $5,000 to the GoFundMe, had organized fundraisers at her church, had believed every word of Rachel's lies. She'd seen the news about McBride's arrest and something clicked in her memory. McBride had approached her during Rachel's cancer journey, had offered to help set up the GoFundMe page, had said he knew how to make it go viral, had handled all the financial details. Lexi realized now that McBride had been running everything from behind the scenes. Rachel had just been the actress he'd put on stage. Lexi said she wanted to testify against him too, wanted to help put him in prison for what he'd done to all of them. Prosecutor Fontana called me 2 days after Lexi's testimony to say they'd found more evidence in McBride's office. Bank records showing wire transfers from the GoFundMe account to offshore accounts in his name. Email chains where he coached Rachel on what symptoms to fake and when to post updates. Text messages proving he'd written most of her social media posts during the cancer scheme. The evidence showed he'd taken 40% of every donation. 85,000 raised meant he'd pocketed 34,000 while Rachel took the public blame. Fontana said the fraud case was reopened with McBride as the primary suspect and Rachel as a cooperating witness. She asked if I wanted to be there when Rachel gave her official testimony. I said yes. Rachel's testimony happened in a conference room at the federal building 3 weeks later. She wore an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, her hair growing back in patches from the real chemotherapy. A court reporter sat in the corner while Fontana asked questions, and Rachel answered in a flat voice that sounded nothing like her usual dramatic tone. She explained how McBride had approached her 2 years before our engagement party, how he'd noticed her posting photos at expensive restaurants and wearing designer clothes she couldn't afford on her retail salary, how he'd suggested a way she could make real money by playing a role. Rachel said McBride had shown her examples of successful GoFundMe campaigns for cancer patients, had explained that people wanted to feel like heroes by donating, had convinced her that they'd be providing a service by giving strangers a chance to do something good. She talked about how he'd created the fake hospital documents using his medical credentials and access to supplies, how he'd taught her what symptoms to describe and how to lose weight safely, how he'd set up the offshore accounts and promised her 60% of everything they raised. Rachel's voice cracked when she described realizing during the wedding that McBride had been skimming extra money the entire time, that her cut had actually been closer to 40% while he'd taken the majority, that he'd manipulated her into being the public face while he'd stayed safely hidden. Her lawyer, a public defender named Morrison, interrupted to say Rachel understood she'd made the choice to participate, that she wasn't claiming to be a victim, that she accepted responsibility for hurting people. But he argued that McBride had groomed her into the scheme by exploiting her financial problems and her need for attention. Fontana asked Rachel about the threatening letters from prison. Rachel pulled out copies she'd been saving for months, letters where McBride talked about their mutual friends and how accidents could happen to people who talked too much, how he'd specifically mentioned my wife by name in one letter, saying it would be terrible if something happened to her since she'd been so generous with her trust. My wife came with me to Rachel's second testimony session a week later. We sat in the back of the conference room while Rachel described the psychological manipulation in more detail. She talked about how McBride had convinced her that donors wanted to feel heroic, that they were giving people purpose by accepting their money, that cancer patients should actually thank people like them for creating opportunities for others to be generous. My wife's hand tightened on mine when Rachel described how McBride had coached her to target family members specifically, how he'd said that making the scheme personal would generate more donations and more emotional investment, how he'd suggested she announce the diagnosis at our engagement party because the contrast between celebration and tragedy would make people more likely to give. Rachel's voice stayed steady through most of it but broke when she talked about believing McBride loved her, about thinking they were partners, about realizing during her arrest that he'd already disappeared and left her to face everything alone. She said she'd protected him for 2 years out of some stupid hope he'd come back, that she'd finally understood he'd never cared about her at all when he'd started threatening her family from hiding. Fontana asked if Rachel had proof McBride had been planning the poisoning scheme before his arrest. Rachel said yes. Pulled out another letter where McBride had written about how my continued investigation into the fraud case made him nervous, how he needed to find a way to distract me or stop me from digging deeper, how having access to my wife through his medical practice was convenient. My wife made a small sound next to me. Rachel looked at her sister for the first time during the testimony. Her eyes were red, but she didn't cry. She just said she was sorry, that she knew sorry wasn't enough, that she'd spent 2 years in prison thinking she deserved everything that happened to her until she'd realized McBride was going to hurt someone else. McBride's trial started 6 weeks later and moved faster than anyone expected. The evidence was overwhelming. The poisoning attempt with documented proof of the custom pills, the fraud conspiracy with emails and bank records, the financial records showing his 40% cut of the donations. His own lawyer, a tired-looking man named Acosta, advised him to take a plea deal after the first week of testimony. McBride refused, took the stand and claimed Rachel had manipulated him, said she'd threatened to expose his medical license violations if he didn't help her, said he'd been afraid of her the entire time. The prosecutor played the recording from our wedding video, McBride whispering to Rachel about getting her collapse on camera, his voice clear and controlling. Nothing about it sounded afraid. Then Fontana played recorded phone calls from the prison where McBride had called Rachel using a friend's phone, his voice threatening, specific, describing exactly how he'd been poisoning my wife and how he'd make it look like natural causes. The jury took 4 hours to convict him on all charges. Victor Sanderson called me 2 days after McBride's conviction, said he'd been Rachel's defense attorney during her original trial and he'd always suspected she wasn't working alone. He'd noticed inconsistencies in her story, medical documents that seemed too professional, financial transactions that were too sophisticated for someone with no banking experience. But he hadn't been able to prove anything, and Rachel had refused to name anyone else. Victor said he wanted to represent Rachel in a sentence reduction hearing based on her cooperation and McBride's manipulation. He argued that while Rachel had committed fraud, she'd been under psychological control of someone with medical credentials and authority, that her cooperation had led to convicting the actual mastermind, that her genuine cancer diagnosis and her willingness to testify despite threats showed real change. I told him to do whatever he thought was right, that Rachel had saved my wife's life, even if she'd also ruined our wedding, that maybe that was worth something. The judge sentenced McBride 3 months later in a courtroom packed with donors from the original GoFundMe campaign, 15 years for attempted murder, additional time for conspiracy to commit fraud and his role in the GoFundMe scheme. No possibility of parole for the first 10 years. Rachel's cooperation and her genuine cancer diagnosis led to her sentence being reduced from 8 years to 4, with 2 already served. The judge said Rachel had committed serious fraud and hurt many people, but he acknowledged that McBride had been the architect and primary beneficiary of the scheme. that Rachel's testimony had been crucial in convicting someone who'd tried to commit murder, that her cancer diagnosis, while not excusing her crimes, demonstrated a certain cosmic justice that made additional punishment seem excessive. Rachel would serve 2 more years and then be released on parole with strict conditions. She'd have to continue cancer treatment, attend therapy, pay restitution from any future earnings. But she'd be out. My wife cried during the sentencing. I wasn't sure if they were tears of relief or something more complicated. Rachel completed her 3rd round of chemotherapy 2 months after the sentencing. I got a call from Cyrus Napier, the prison medical coordinator, saying her scans showed the treatment was working. The tumors had shrunk significantly. The cancer markers in her blood had dropped to nearly normal levels. Cyrus said Rachel was responding better than expected, that she seemed to have something real to fight for now instead of just going through the motions. He said she'd been asking about my wife, wanting to know if she was fully recovered, if the poison had caused any permanent damage. I told him my wife was fine, completely healthy, no lasting effects. Cyrus said Rachel had cried when he told her that. Real crying, not the performed kind. He said he'd been working in prison medical for 15 years, and he could usually tell the difference. My wife surprised me one morning by saying she wanted to visit Rachel in prison, that she needed to have a conversation with her sister without me as a middleman. I felt nervous about it, but I drove her to the prison and waited in the visitor area while she went through security. I sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair for 2 hours, reading outdated magazines and watching other families visit their incarcerated relatives. Kids running around, wives looking tired, parents looking older than they should. My wife came out looking drained but calm. She didn't say much on the drive home, just stared out the window at the passing scenery. That night, my wife told me what they'd talked about. 2 hours of conversation mostly about their childhood, about how Rachel had always felt like she was competing for attention, how their parents had praised my wife for being responsible and steady while treating Rachel like she was dramatic and difficult, how Rachel had learned that the only way to get noticed was to make everything about herself, to be louder, more emotional, more demanding. My wife said Rachel had apologized not just for the wedding, but for years of making every family gathering about her problems, every holiday about her drama, every celebration about her crisis. Rachel had said she'd been jealous of our engagement, of the attention my wife was finally getting, of people being happy for her instead of worried about Rachel. That the fake cancer scheme had started as a way to steal that attention back, but had spiraled into something she couldn't control once McBride got involved. My wife said she told Rachel she forgave her, that she needed time to rebuild trust, that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting or pretending the hurt hadn't happened. Rachel had apparently accepted that, had said she didn't expect anything more, that just knowing her sister didn't hate her was more than she deserved. The documentary crew from Terminal Lies contacted us a week later about filming an update episode. They wanted to cover McBride's arrest and trial, Rachel's real cancer diagnosis, the poisoning scheme, the whole twisted story of how the woman who'd faked cancer had ended up with real cancer and had saved someone's life by telling the truth. We declined to participate in any filming, told them we were done being part of Rachel's story in any public way. But we gave them permission to use the parking lot footage from our wedding video, the evidence that had helped solve the case. They said the update episode would air in 3 months, and all proceeds would go to cancer research. We said that was fine. We just didn't want to be on camera talking about it anymore. 6 months passed, and my wife looked healthier than I'd seen her in years. The dark circles under her eyes disappeared. She stopped getting confused in the middle of conversations. Her energy came back, and she started running again in the mornings. We found her a new doctor at a hospital across town, someone with no connection to McBride or anyone from that nightmare. She went to her first appointment nervous about trusting another doctor. But this one listened. Actually listened. Ran proper tests. Explained everything. My wife started going to support groups for people who'd experienced medical harm. She talked about trusting your gut when something feels wrong, about getting second opinions, about not letting doctors dismiss your symptoms. Other people listened to her story and shared their own. She found purpose in it. Started a blog about patient advocacy, got invited to speak at medical conferences about the patient perspective. Rachel's letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Plain prison envelope. My wife held it for a long time before opening it. The handwriting looked shaky, but the words were clear. Rachel's cancer had gone into remission. 6 months of treatment, and the scans came back clean. They were moving her out of the medical ward back to general population. The letter was different from the others she'd sent. No drama, no performance, just simple sentences about being grateful and scared and hopeful. She thanked us for visiting, for believing her about McBride when nobody else would have. She said she knew she didn't deserve our help, but she was trying to become someone who did. My wife read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it in a drawer with the others. She said Rachel sounded real for the first time ever. Prosecutor Fontana called with news about the money. Her team had tracked down most of what McBride stole from the GoFundMe. He'd hidden it in different accounts under fake names, but financial investigators found the trail. They recovered $65,000. Fontana's office started the process of returning it to everyone who donated. My wife's grandmother got back the money from selling her jewelry. Our friends who'd taken second jobs got their donations back. Lexi got a check for the $5,000 she'd contributed. $20,000 was gone forever, lost in accounts they couldn't access or already spent. But most people said they were just glad to know the real criminal got caught. That Rachel had been manipulated too. That at least some good came from all of it. The therapist's office was small with beige walls and uncomfortable chairs. My wife and I sat side by side while Rachel appeared on the video screen from the prison counseling room. These sessions happened every other week. At first, nobody knew what to say. We all just sat there staring at each other through the screen. But slowly things started coming out. Rachel talked about growing up feeling invisible next to my wife, how their parents praised my wife for being responsible and steady while treating Rachel like she was too much, too loud, too emotional, too dramatic. Rachel said she learned early that the only way to get attention was to have a crisis. The therapist said Rachel's fraud was an extreme version of that pattern, a lifetime of feeling overlooked exploding into something massive and destructive. My wife cried during one session and said she never knew Rachel felt that way, that she'd thought Rachel just liked being the center of attention. Rachel said she did like it, but only because it was the only time anyone really saw her. Rachel got approved for a work release program in her final year. She'd be working at a nonprofit that helped fraud victims navigate financial recovery. The program director called it restorative justice, making Rachel use her knowledge of how cons work to help people who'd been conned. Rachel started going to their office 3 days a week under supervision. Her boss sent updates saying Rachel was surprisingly good at the job. She could spot fraud patterns instantly, knew all the psychological tricks scammers used, could explain to victims how they'd been manipulated without making them feel stupid. The boss said Rachel seemed genuinely invested in helping people, that she worked harder than most paid employees, that she'd found something real to care about besides herself. Our third wedding anniversary was nothing like our actual wedding day. We had dinner at a quiet restaurant, just the two of us. No family drama, no medical emergencies, no cameras or crowds. My wife wore a blue dress and smiled more than she had in years. We talked about regular things, work and friends and plans for the summer. Normal couple stuff. It felt like what our wedding should have been. The next day, we drove to the prison and brought photos from dinner. Rachel looked at them through the glass partition and said we looked happy. Really happy. Not the stressed fake happy from 3 years ago. She said she was glad we finally got the celebration we deserved. She didn't try to make it about herself, didn't mention her own situation or ask for sympathy. Just seemed genuinely happy for us. My wife reached toward the glass like she wanted to hug her sister. Rachel put her hand up on the other side. They stayed like that for a minute. The medical board investigation took 8 months. They reviewed McBride's entire career. Found evidence he'd been running small cons for years before the big GoFundMe scheme. Fake billing codes, unnecessary procedures, insurance fraud. They revoked his license permanently, sent letters to every hospital and clinic in the state warning them about him, started implementing new background check requirements for all physicians, mandatory ethics reviews every 2 years, better oversight of billing practices, random audits of patient records. The board chair gave a press conference saying they'd failed to catch McBride sooner and were implementing changes to prevent future cases. Several other doctors got investigated based on what they found in McBride's records. 2 more lost their licenses. The whole system got shaken up. Rachel's release day came 4 years after her sentencing. My wife and I drove to the prison early in the morning. Other families waited in the parking lot too, people getting their loved ones back. Rachel walked out carrying a clear plastic bag with her belongings. She looked older, thinner. Her hair had grown back gray at the temples. She stood on the steps for a moment, looking around like she couldn't believe she was outside. My wife got out of the car first. They hugged carefully like they weren't sure it was allowed. Rachel climbed into the back seat and we drove away from the prison. Nobody talked much. Rachel stared out the window at everything passing by. Trees and buildings and people walking dogs. Normal life happening everywhere. She had strict parole conditions. Weekly therapy sessions, community service, regular check-ins with her parole officer. No social media, no fundraising of any kind. She'd be living in a halfway house with other women transitioning out of prison. The car ride felt awkward, but not hostile. Just uncertain. Like we were all figuring out how to be around each other now. The halfway house was in an old converted apartment building downtown. Rachel got a small room with a bed and a desk. She continued working at the fraud victim nonprofit, now as a paid employee making minimum wage. Her coworkers knew her history. The boss said honesty was part of her rehabilitation. Rachel started attending cancer survivor support groups too. She told her story to rooms full of people who'd actually had cancer. Explained that she'd faked it once and then gotten it for real. Used her experience to talk about the psychology of fraud and manipulation. Some people walked out, others stayed and asked questions. Rachel said it was harder than prison, facing people she'd hurt, admitting what she'd done over and over. But her therapist said it was necessary. That real change required facing the damage she'd caused. A year after her release, Rachel came to Thanksgiving dinner at our house. She brought rolls from the bakery near her apartment, sat at the table with my wife and me and a few other family members. She looked healthy. Her hair was fully gray now and she'd stopped dyeing it. The cancer was still in remission, She went to her oncology appointments religiously and sent us the scan results every time. All clear. All clear. All clear. She worked full-time at the nonprofit now with benefits and a small salary. She'd moved out of the halfway house into her own studio apartment. She talked about her therapy and her support groups like they were just normal parts of her life. When someone asked her how she was doing, she said fine and meant it. No drama, no crisis, just fine. My wife reached over and squeezed her hand during dessert. Rachel squeezed back and said she was grateful to be here, that she finally understood genuine connection was worth more than any performance. That being real was harder than faking, but it was the only thing that actually mattered. I watched her face while she said it, looking for signs of the old Rachel, the performer, the con artist, but I didn't see it. For the first time since I'd known her, I actually believed her.